The sun lay like a hot coin on the desert, making the horizon shimmer and the air taste of iron and dust. The cradle was half buried at the edge of a dry arroyo, the pale wood sticking up like a confession. Eli Mercer rode up, the leather of his saddle slick with sweat, and the cradle rocked with a small, stubborn sound, like a bird trying to sing through sand. At the foot of the cradle, someone had pressed a scrap of paper with a black mark, a small burned bird that looked almost like a signature. He dismounted slow, and his boots sunk into hot sand, his fingers smelling of smoke and old rope. He reached the cradle, and his hand trembled when he touched the tiny chest moving beneath the thin blanket. The baby was still breathing. Eli froze, mouth dry, and for a second the desert held its breath with him. He could have left the scrap as a warning or a relic, but he lifted the child instead, the cradle scraping noise fading behind him. He had a choice then that would split the town into those who forgave and those who sought to bury what hurt them. He tucked the scrap into his coat and turned his horse toward the ranch house called Iron Hollow. The name felt ironic that day. Eli Mercer, rancher and loner, had a face like old wood and hands that remembered every fence post he had ever set. Between dust and pity, he would learn whether mercy could be paid for in blood or in bread. Eli arrived to a small rancho, with a lean dog sleeping by the stoop and smoke curling from a stove inside. The house smelled of boiled coffee and old wool, of the laundered shirts he never seemed to get done. He laid the baby on his knee, felt the pulse at the throat like a bird that might fold its wings at any moment. He washed the little face with water that tasted of iron from the well, and wrapped the infant in a blanket that had once been his sister Maybelle's. The blanket smelled of lavender and saddle oil. He called for Lila, the midwife who lived 3 houses over, because she knew the ways of small lives and how to mend a fever. Lila came with a tin cup and a bag of clean cloths, her hand steady though her eyes grew wide at the sight of the scrap with the burned bird. They worked in a hush, but with urgent talk, the kind that threads itself through hands as they work. Eli spoke only a few words, the kind that are too heavy to throw into the open, but Lila filled the spaces like warm milk. She asked whose child, who left it, what mark did the scrap mean. They drew a clean line around the tiny wrist where a faint mark like a pinprick scar might hide. The baby kept breathing. Later that night, under a low lamp, Eli held the child while Lila braided off a curl of hair and hummed a lullaby that the town had forgotten. The dog thumped a tail against the floor, as if to remind the world that even in the roughest places, a small heart could demand kindness. They named the scrap of paper the Signal, and the baby they called Mercy, because Eli could not say otherwise. Word traveled fast in a small town with empty rooms for gossip. The next morning, when the air had cooled to a brittle clarity, Sheriff Egan rode up with a government man in regulation and a mounted courier bearing a printed poster. The poster showed a sketch of a woman and offered a reward for a deserter whose name the town muttered with contempt. The courier hammered the paper to the general store board, and all the men gathered like flies to the suite. Eli watched them read and fold the paper into hands that already decided things without hearing the whole of it. The government man explained protocol, his voice flat, the way paper and seal give a righteousness that people bend to. He asked questions about the scrap, about any sign of ownership, and about the burned bird. Sheriff Egan asked in turn if Eli had any claim to the child, or if the child would be turned over to the proper authorities. Eli could have lied, could have said he found nothing, but he met Egan's eyes and said he would keep the child safe until they could find the truth. The lawyer and the government man made a soft sound, and the courier wrote the town's name into the report. Outside, Tomas, who ran the livery, spat into the dirt and muttered that the desert had swallowed what the town deserved. Maribel at the mill watched from her window and pressed her hands to the glass as if trying to press the baby back into being. The poster fluttered like a warning, and the burned bird on the scrap seemed to smolder in people's minds. The town split into clocks that kept different time. Some felt pity, and some felt the hardness of old debts. If the face of the law was paper, the face of the town was stone and gossip. Eli had to earn trust the way he had once earned water for a field. He put the baby in a cradle repaired with nails and string, fed by Lila and by Maribel, who brought soft bread and a blanket with a faded sun stitched in the corner. Lila told him things in short sentences, and in the cadence of midwifery, the way to tell a fever from a hunger and how to tuck a hip into sleep. Eli listened and confessed small things in return. He told of a childhood that smelled of stables and other people's anger, of a brother lost to fever, and a wife who left before the winter. He swore no man would cross him again. He spoke of the rancho and the ridge where his father had planted cotton and called it legacy, though it was mostly a debt. His voice landed like gravel. Lila pressed her palm to his sleeve and said that hands like his could save a child and be saved by it too. She named names of the town who might help. Reverend Hale, who would bless a cradle, Old Man Rourke, who had stores of herbs, Deputy Silva, who still owed favors, and Mayor Briggs, who managed the courthouse with the eyes of a hawk. They all became part of the story, droplets on the leaf of that first night. At noon, a stranger came down the main street, a man in a soldier coat that had seen too many winters, with papers folded in a leather case and a face like weather. He called himself Captain Rowe of the Frontier Patrol, and he had a map of the region and an official order to investigate any abandoned children found near the border. He asked for details about the burned bird and the cradle. Eli showed him the scrap and kept the baby close to his chest, the way you keep a lit ember when you fear for your hands. The captain read the mark and frowned. He asked where the child had been found and who had seen the mother. Eli recounted his ride out to the arroyo, the smell of smoke, the cradle half buried, and the bird mark seared onto paper. Rowe tapped the scrap as if to awaken a memory and said colors could mean affiliations, and burned symbols could be a message between outlaws or a warning left by a desperate mother. The captain warned of bounty hunters and of men who would see a child as a currency. The town listened, and the air vibrated with a tension that tasted like iron. It was at this point, after the captain left with his clipped promise to return if needed, that the channel to the audience opened. If this tale had tugged at you so far, the narrator might ask, "What would you do in Eli's place?" and invite you to start your sentence with, "I would save," or "I would hand over." The town would read your words and find comfort or condemnation in them, and the next night would bring men to test those answers. Eli and Lila developed a quiet of trust over the next days. The baby, small and fierce, smelled of milk and sun and the faint tang of the arroyo. Eli fed it with a cup and later with a bottle, because Lila said small mouths sometimes learn from strangers. There was a symbol that kept returning to him in dreams, and when he blinked awake at night, the burned bird looked less like an accusation and more like a plea. He found a drawing in the dirt one afternoon, a crude bird with one wing bent, and believed it could be an initial or a message. He traced it with his finger and told Lila about a girl he had once loved who wore a pin shaped like a dove. Lila listened, and then, in a break of trust, told him a backstory of her own. She had been a midwife in 3 towns, had watched children be born in wagons and in fields, had held hands as mothers whispered names. She told of a scandal in her past, of a baby she had kept secret for a family that could not claim it, and of a night the town burned a wagon, and she buried a scrap with a mark to keep a story alive. Her voice filled 3 paragraphs of memory like a river carving bedrock. Eli felt the town loosening, a little, like a fist tired from clenching. He named the baby Mercy in the open now, and found himself promising to keep her until truth or law told him otherwise. Rumors gathered like clouds. People said they had seen tracks near the arroyo, or that a woman had been taken by wagon early at dawn toward the northern road. Parson Hale mentioned sin from his pulpit, and Mayor Briggs had your typical concern for order, but with an edge that hinted at fear of losing face. Tomas, the liveryman, said the coast was full of men who would claim a child for coin, and Maribel whispered that no woman had been seen with a baby for weeks. Old Man Rourke claimed he had seen a horse with a red ribbon near the arroyo the night before, and Deputy Silva swore he had followed doubled tracks and found only coyote prints. The town divided into those who wanted to shelter the child and those who wanted to hand it over to official channels, so that the reward and the law could be satisfied. Their words were thrown like stones in the general store, and one night someone hung a paper on Eli's gate with a burnt edge and the same burned bird stamped onto it. It was a clear message. Some clapped Eli on the shoulder and said he did right. Others spat and said he would bring trouble. Tension thickened into a fog over dinners and in porches, the way a night fog creeps over low ground. Confrontation came with a party of men who believed they represented the town's true interest. They arrived at dusk carrying lanterns and the smell of whiskey and stale leather. They spoke in rough voices and asked Eli to turn over the child. He answered that he would not. They told him law meant reward and order, and he said law also had holes where mercy could fall through. Words grew teeth. Tomas accused Eli of hiding criminals. Maribel said every town must obey the frontiermen. Deputy Silva tried to mediate and asked for patience. Mayor Briggs read the official poster as if that alone gave weight. The argument became voices, and voices became shoves. Eli stood with the baby in his arms and said his house would not be a courthouse, and his arms were no place to judge a child. The leader of the men, a broad man named Harrow, set a lantern too close to the scrap paper stuck in Eli's coat. Someone swore. A hand reached to push Harrow back, and the lantern tilted. For a heartbeat, the smell of oil and cotton rose sharp, and the scrap caught a flare. Lila moved faster than anyone and stamped the flame out with her heel. Men breathed like animals relieved from a trap. They left, but not before Harrow carved a promise into the gatepost with a small knife. It read like a threat. The town had shown its teeth, and the sheriff sighed, torn between the paperwork he owed and the life trembling in Eli's arms. That night, Eli lay awake and listened to the creak of the porch and to Mercy's small, fierce breaths. The next day, the threat grew into action. Men came that night to burn the scrap nailed to the gate and to leave a sign that this town would not protect what it could not understand. They circled like coyotes and set the scrap ablaze. The heat threw their faces into orange slices. Eli rushed out with a gun in his hand, not to slay, but to stand between flame and cradle. Harrow shouted that the town had to cleanse itself and that property and precedent mattered more than sentiment. Reverend Hale prayed aloud, asking God to fix the hearts of men. Voices rose, until Elijah, a name no one in town used, but Eli heard it in the urgency, and it steadied him. He said, with a voice slow and flat like a hammer on iron, that if the town wanted a fire, they could have his barn, but not a child. The men wavered, and in the wavering, a shot cracked the air. The bullet passed through a beam, and splinters rained down. Lights came on in windows, and from those windows came faces like Maribel's and Tomas and Lila's and Old Man Rourke's. They held little things in their hands, spoons and shawls, as if to show that they were ready to protect life with small tools. The town had reached an edge. For a second, the world balanced, and then backs turned and footsteps thudded away into the night. That moment of near violence became a scar on the street, a memory the town could not unsee. It was a tension of 5 paragraphs that left the ground smoldering. Harrow did not relent. He organized men who hunted in the dusk, claiming to act for order. Word came that a small group had been hired to track those who hide children from reward to take them to the nearest marshal. Captain Rowe returned with 2 mounted men and asked for the scrap. He read the burned bird and said it was a symbol used by a band from the South that trafficked infants to richer houses. Eli rebelled at the thought and demanded evidence. Roe said the law had to follow leads. Lila stood with Eli, Reverend Hale at their side, and Old Man Rourke offering a bag of herbs and Deputy Silva a promise to watch the path. The group formed a plan to take Mercy out of town for a night and move her to a woman named Anna at the river trading post who could hide a child. The plan was whispered in 8 voices, each voice a line in a rope. Eli rode first with Mercy swaddled, Lila behind, Tomas with spare saddles, Maribel and Old Man Rourke on foot, and Deputy Silva pretending to make rounds. They threaded the Arroyo Road under a moon that shone like a coin tossed into dark water. The desert smelled of creosote and wet stone from a recent rare rain. They moved slow and careful, listening for hoofbeats that did not belong to them. Halfway to the river came the ambush. Men stepped from the shadows like ghosts of old grudges. The air filled with gun smoke and the whine of lead. Eli turned the horse and fired, a quick iron sound that left his shoulder ringing. Lila dove and clutched Mercy to her chest, and Tomas shouted orders the way he had once herded mules. Maribel screamed once and then became a steady presence, a hand to catch falling things. Deputy Silva tried to pull a man off his horse, and the man swung a knife that cut the air where a throat would be. For what felt like an hour but was only minutes, they were in a world of flashes. A shot took the flank of Eli's horse, and the animal bucked. Eli dropped and rolled, felt an agony like fire shooting through his leg. He tasted copper and dust. Old Man Rourke threw his weight at a man with a torch, and they crashed. Someone cried mercy, and the child wailed with a sound that broke the night in two. In the middle of the chaos, Eli saw Harrow with the burned bird patch on his sleeve like a trophy. He lunged, and for a moment their bodies met like 2 pieces of a puzzle that do not fit. Eli felt a blade tear his side, and he fell. The world narrowed to the weight of the child and the smell of wet earth. Then, from the dark, Deputy Silva's shout and the reply of more boots. The attackers retreated, leaving blood and a trail of scorched paper. The ambush had been a turning point that cost Eli more than he expected. In the frenzy, someone had shot him through the flank, leg, and left him with a wound that asked for both skill and mercy. They carried Eli back to Iron Hollow, where Lila tore her apron and tied a bandage with a skill that came from many nights like this. She mopped sweat and cleaned the wound, and she said words like stitch and suture and stitch again, until the pain became a manageable companion. The sheriff came, and his face had the look of a man who had slept badly and had seen too much. Captain Rowe now wore a new respect, as men who witness sacrifice sometimes do. Eli and Lila spoke in the hush after the fever broke, in a room that smelled of tea and boiled herbs, where each whisper felt like a confession. Eli admitted that for years he had built walls of quiet around his life because he feared that attachment meant always losing. Lila confessed that she had hoped for a home beyond the work and the cold hands, and that Mercy felt unwieldy and impossible, and right. Their voices became intimate when they exchanged truths about names and places. Eli revealed that his brother had been taken by a posse once, accused of stealing water, and that he had watched children grow up without him. Lila revealed that her real name was Doña Isabel, and that she had once loved a man who left for the sea and never returned. The two of them, in a series of confessions, decided that mercy would not be hidden because of fear, but kept because a child had no right to be the ledger of adults. They bent to the child and kissed small fingers, with an intimacy that turned the pain into a brittle sort of joy. In the days after the ambush, the town took sides more clearly. Reverend Hale wrote a blessing and posted it on the church door. Mayor Briggs convened a council and tried to make sense of the papers and the burned bird that sat like an accusation between mercy and law. Harrow and his men were arrested for conspiracy to terrorize, an act that carried a punishment if a court could be found willing. And Captain Rowe agreed to investigate the band rumored to traffic children. In the meantime, people brought food and folded clothes, and children like Sarah and Josiah came to press their noses to the cradle and ask questions that broke the hardest faces into smiles. Names kept appearing as the story braided itself into the town's life. Anna at the river had offered to hide them if needed. Maribel knit a scarf. Tomas repaired the damaged saddle. Old Man Rourke tended the small garden, and Deputy Silva kept watch on the road. These hands stitched a safety net with conversation and small acts until Eli and Lila learned they were better together than they were alone. The backstories of Eli and Lila unfolded in 3 slow paragraphs that felt like a deep cut, healed over time. Eli remembered his father teaching him to mend a fence while humming a tune that meant work and waiting. He remembered the cotton fields and the way the land made a man of patience and of stubbornness. He remembered a promise he made to a brother he could not save. Those memories were old rope that bound him to a life of solitude. Lila's backstory was of a girl raised to be useful, apprenticed to a midwife at 12, who had learned the art of bringing the world a little kinder. She had crossed deserts to help women in childbirth, had kept secrets for families, and had watched the cruelty of towns when they feared scandal more than grief. She had a scar on her hand from a baby who had slipped and fallen and nearly died, and she had saved that child with an old trick of pressing warm cloth to the chest. These stories together made a cradle of reasons why they could not simply hand mercy over to paper and reward. Each paragraph built to about 900 characters, a tapestry of choice and history that explained why 2 people stood against an entire town's inertia. There were moments of tension after the recovery where Eli had to decide whether to flee with mercy or to stand and fight for a life inside the town. One night they paced the porch and listened to the wind go through the cottonwood. Eli said he could leave, that there was a trail to the south and a man named Navarro who would take them across to a place where no poster would follow. Lila said her hands had too many ties here. They argued with the soft vocabs of people in love and in fear. She said she could not abandon those who had brought food and care. He said he could not give mercy to a world where bounty mattered more than breath. The tension settled when they realized the decision was not only theirs. The town would have to change, or they would leave. It was a 2-paragraph moment that felt heavy and like the hinge of a door. They chose to stay. They organized nightly watches and registered complaints with Captain Rowe, who had become an uneasy ally. The last attempt to take mercy came under the cover of a windstorm. Men crept with laced boots and blacked faces. Eli waited and met them at the fence with a rifle and a calm that surprised them. He called out their leader by name and offered the law instead of a trap, saying, "Take me to court, but not the child." The leader faltered, and a shot cut the air that time without human aim, and hit the ground near a horse. It was enough to scare them away. The town had shown its willingness to protect a child. Mercy slept through it all, and the sound of her breathing stitched the cold into something softer. 1 month later, the town had changed in small ways. The front of the general store had a new sign saying Mercy's Corner, where people left jars and cloths. Maribel and Tomas organized a rota for diapers and soup. Reverend Hale had delivered a sermon about compassion and gave a coin he said was saved for prayer. Old Man Rourke had planted a small bed of herbs outside the church, and Deputy Silva had taken to sitting at the gate in the evenings. Eli still limped, and he drank less than he used to in public. Lila had begun teaching other women how to tend to infants and to read a midwife's ledger. Anna at the river sent a steady stream of news about the South and whether the band with the bird mark had been seen. Captain Rowe had posted a deputy at the road and promised to keep watch. There was a small celebration when Mercy laughed for the first time, and children from the neighborhood came with scraps of ribbon to tie to the cradle. The burned bird scrap that had been a symbol of fear was now framed above the stove as a reminder that a mark could mean both harm and hope. This first epilogue moment was like a photograph, warm, humble, and safe. 3 months on, the rancho had a different rhythm. A woman named Sarah had taken to bringing mercy beads she had made out of clay and painting their faces with smiles. Mayor Briggs had publicly apologized for the haste with which he had read the posters, and had offered to fund a midwife's box for the town. Harrow had been fined and forced to work on the town road, repairing fences, and perhaps, more importantly, the strokes of his public shame left him quieter. The captain had tracked the bird-marked band to a shack and found only scattered papers and a journal that spoke of desperation and trade in children as if they were goods. The town read the entries in horror and sorrow, and understood that law alone would not tend to the wound. Eli taught Mercy to balance on a wooden stool, and she learned the feel of his boot leather as a ground. Lila and Eli had learned small rituals: a cup of coffee at dawn, a list of chores shared, hands that touched without asking permission. The town had grown protective in a way that made outsiders slow to confront them. This second epilogue paragraph was about mending and community, and the way small acts build a refuge. 6 months later, there was a small house painted in a pale blue on the far side of the rancho, where Eli and Lila sat on a bench with Mercy between them. The rancho had grown a new fence of cedar, and the cottonwood by the arroyo now had children's swings tied to its branches. Anna had returned with a baby she took into care for 3 days, and then left a note that read, "Thank you for the courage to keep this life." Captain Rowe had been reassigned, but left a brass button on the table with a note that said, "Keep watch and keep faith." Deputy Silva had applied for a promotion and had started school part-time because Lila had taught him how to count the stitches in a suture. The town held a small celebration with bread and a song that had been written by Josiah about the day the cradle rocked in the sand. Mercy ran between legs and laughed in a voice that had no fear. People like Maribel and Tomas and Old Man Rourke and Reverend Hale and Mayor Briggs and Anna and Deputy Silva all stood in the yard and watched as Eli and Lila shared a look of a promise that was not loud but durable. A child had reshaped them all. The burned bird scrap rested in a box with other relics of the ordeal, and it seemed to have become more of a talisman than a threat. The final part of the epilogue closed with the sense that life goes on in small steps and in stubborn acts of care. When the narrator closed the book on Eli's years at Iron Hollow, they returned once more to the image of the half-buried cradle at the arroyo. The desert had not forgotten that day, and it kept the memory like a fossil in the sand. The town that had once been ready to trade a child for law had reached for mercy instead, and the price was not small. Eli learned that saving another life can make a man ask for saving himself. Lila learned that love could be work and also breath. Mercy grew like a stubborn green shoot through cracked earth and taught them all that some things are worth sheltering no matter how much the world asks for ledger and coin. If this story touched you, stay and listen to the next one and tell someone else what mercy looks like in your town. In the end, Eli kept the scrap with the burned bird, not as a record of fear, but as a reminder that even a small mark can change the course of many lives.